This episode is brought to you by Forney Industries, official sponsor of Faction 46 and Nice Motorsports Truck Series teams. Forney offers versatile welding and plasma cutting machines, along with a full line of metalworking accessories for beginners, do-it-yourselfers, and professionals. Forney has everything you need for your next metalworking project. Shop for these top-of-the-line products at forneyInd.com. That's FORNEYIND.com, or at an authorized Forney dealer near you.
Hey y'all, Rick Houston here, and I want to tell you about my new show, the Moonshine and Motorsports Racing Podcast. I've partnered up with the state of North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources to help uncover the history behind moonshining mountain boys, professional wheelmen, and the backwoods and city lights of the Tar Heel State. In the first episode, I sat down with Winston Kelly at the NASCAR Hall of Fame for a little behind-the-scenes gossip about Junior Johnson's engineering skills.
He's got two things in his hand, pipe wrench and channel lock pliers, and they weren't new. They had been around the block a time or two.
Wasn't the first steel they built, I bet.
No. I think the pliers had been red before, but paint had worn off.
And in the second episode, I talked to a professional hillbilly, a.k.a. Dr. Daniel Pierce of UNC Asheville, to find out the real history of moonshiners and their battles with the revenuers.
He wrote about one of his experience of trying to chase down this bootlegger in this souped-up car, and he complained that the government gave him these piece of crap, cheapo cars, and that were really no match, but he thought he was doing pretty good, and then the guy just hits it and just takes off and practically disappeared. But then the guy makes a bootleg turn and comes back towards him. And as he said, it was a game of chicken, and I was a chicken. And so he ran off the road. And actually, he was the guy who caught Junior Johnson at his daddy's steel when Junior got tangled up in a barbed wire fence.
So check out the Moonshine and Motorsports Racing Podcast, available on YouTube, dailydownforce.com, and all of your favorite podcasting platforms. And be sure to check out my regular show on NASCAR history, the Scene Vault Podcast.
Hey there, NASCAR fans. Have you got your copy of the latest edition of NASCAR Pole Position Print Magazine? If not, there's no better time than now to subscribe at polepositionmag.com. NASCAR Pole Position is the only print magazine covering NASCAR. Officially licensed by NASCAR, NASCAR Pole Position Magazine is published throughout the NASCAR season, and each edition is an instant collector's item, packed with great feature stories and photography. The magazine is even mailed to you in a poly bag for those who love to collect NASCAR memorabilia. At polepositionmag.com, you can even find past issues available to purchase. Get your subscription to NASCAR Pole Position and get great NASCAR content delivered straight to your mailbox throughout the season. Learn more at polepositionmag.com. That's polepositionmag.com.
Eric Estep here. One of my favorite parts of being a NASCAR fan is collecting diecasts. It's how I got my start on YouTube, actually. To me, a room is not complete until it features shelves of NASCAR diecast cars. It's as good a time as ever to continue your collection or begin an all-new one by pre-ordering your favorite driver's 2022 Next Gen diecast at lionelracing.com or at any authorized Lionel retailer. Lionel is the official diecast of NASCAR, and don't miss Lionel Racing's NASCAR Authentics diecasts at a Walmart or Target near you. Not only is Lionel the official diecast of NASCAR, but they're also official supporters of the Out of the Groove podcast network. So what are you waiting for? Head to lionelracing.com to order your favorite driver's 2022 diecast.
Hello, folks, and welcome back into Next Gen Creators, the Daily Downforce podcast, where we talk about the next generation of NASCAR content creators. I am Joshua Lipowski, once again here with you, and we have a very special guest coming up with us today on this podcast. Frogbeard is our guest for this one. You may know him for his website, Last Car on Brock. He also has a YouTube channel, Brock Beard, and he's also done some stuff with NASCAR Man History as well. The NASCAR on Brock site has been on the internet for quite a while, and he's kind of gotten back into the YouTube game here over the last few years as well. But his website, NASCAR on Brock, has been there for a little while longer. You also might know him for writing the biography for J.D. McDuffie, and also is in the process of writing Derek Cope's documentary as well. So Brock Beard is someone that has a very interesting perspective. He loves to highlight last place finishers, as is known for his website NASCAR on Brock. But this interview is going to give you some insight into the reason behind it. It's in no way, and as you can tell from his content, it's in no way to poke too much fun at these people. It really is truly about telling stories, and it really is just about, talking about this part of inside of NASCAR that oftentimes is not talked about as much by certain people. So he talks about some very unique perspectives, and he also gives us some insight into kind of just his passion that he has for the site and for what he puts out there. So without further ado, here is Next Gen Creators with Brock Beard. Hello, folks, and now it's time to welcome in Brock Beard to this episode of Next Gen Creators. I have Brock right here with me over Zoom, and Brock, really great to have you on here today.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Brock, we'll start here. Tell me, how did you get into NASCAR to start out?
Well, good question. I live over in Northern California, so not exactly traditionally known as the hotbed of the sport. But I am one of the generation that was brought in by Days of Thunder back when it was originally brought into theaters. Saw it a couple times and was just captivated by it. That was easily my first exposure really to racing in general, and definitely to NASCAR. And I think in some ways it kind of set some unrealistic expectations as to what you actually see on TV with the Hollywood effects of all that. But that definitely brought me in. And then shortly after that, seeing it in person, 1992, I attended my first NASCAR race when I was 9 years old at the Sonoma Raceway, or we still call it Sears Point up in this neck of the woods. I just fell in love with it even more. I mean, to hear the actual sounds of it. This was during Richard Petty's retirement tour. First race seeing Ernie Irvan go from the back to the front. And I think particularly from that race, and especially in the next couple of years, really kind of seeing, how big the fields were and how you had a lot of different drivers. You had the top names, and then you had other drivers in the back. Back then you had Winston West guys that ran in NASCAR, and maybe kind of want to know more about those drivers. So really kind of from an early phase, I was always very interested in not just the big names, whether it was Earnhardt or Davey Allison or Darrell Waltrip or something. But all these other cars that were in the field, like who are these other drivers, and what was their story? I think that was really what got me going. But definitely I'd say probably the crashes brought me into the sport first. Earliest memory I remembered was Rick Mast flipping upside down at Talladega in 1991. Seeing that on TV, that's probably the first race I actually saw on TV. And then the paint schemes too. I just back then, I mean, so many iconic ones between Earnhardt's and Harry Gant's and so forth. It was at a time that I think it really made it very easy for outsiders to be brought into the sport because so many things stayed the same from 1 week to the next. And you got to focus on the racecraft of these different tracks. And as Cole Trickle said to Days of Thunder, ESPN, the coverage is excellent. And I would have to agree. They were the gold standard for me growing up. And even as a West Coast viewer, didn't mind waking up at 9:30 or 10 a.m. for a race over here. It was just as much fun. So that was the era I grew up in.
Bob Jenkins, Ned Jarrett, Benny Parsons in the booth together. I mean, you can't beat that. You absolutely can't beat that. I mean, I've rewatched the 1992 Hooters 500 multiple times, and man, you just can't beat those three in the booth. You're so right about that. And, to provide some context on what you're talking about, people forget in those days, like in the late 80s, early 90s, how many people were lining up to to enter in NASCAR races. I think I saw in your video you did about the Speed Weeks in 1988, just a few years before. I think there were 70 entries in the Daytona 500 that year. I mean, it was crazy. And even just a couple years after that, there were over 80 entries in the first ever Brickyard 400 just 2 years after in 1994. So, I mean, that era of NASCAR, I mean, there were a lot of people that were just trying to make it just to be in the field in general.
Absolutely. I mean, it would have been, I would have been an absolute hog heaven to be doing what I do now, covering these races, being able to go into the infield and to just rub elbows with that many different drivers out there, knowing that they're all trying to make, anywhere from a 36 to a 43 car field back then. And knowing that a lot of them are going to be DNQs and just trying to just take it all in. It must have been so overwhelming for people who were, beat reporters at the time, or people who worked for NASCAR scene or anything like that. And yet thankfully there was such great coverage from that time. You can kind of go back and really kind of dig up some of those stories. I mean, I think I've been covering races in person or in the garage area at Sears Point since 2010. And really at that point, I think even then we had 47, 48 cars for 43 spots. And that seemed like a lot. So to think of 50, 60, 70, or as you mentioned, even 80 cars, that just boggles the mind.
No, it absolutely does. And I remember kind of when I was growing up in because I grew up in the late 2000s, early 2010s, kind of the COT era, it was common to see, close to 50 entries at a race at certain points in that sense. So, you talk about that, how you kind of got into NASCAR growing up and you really were into kind of the back markers, kind of like the people that, were just trying to make it in the sport kind of in some way. Do you have a favorite NASCAR moment from these field fillers, I guess, the way, because you have a podcast, Rise of the Field Fillers, on your channel. So do you have a favorite NASCAR field filler moment that you had growing up that kind of hooked you to these individuals?
It's a good question. There's a lot of other ones that stand out from different eras. And that's one thing I've always enjoyed about the sport. I mean, I always tell people that this is my soap opera. I don't watch soap operas, but I watch this every week. And, the cast of characters changes and the story stays the same. It's always somebody new being brought in. But for the field fillers, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I think back to, drivers that, I mean, whether it was, I mean, even if they weren't necessarily underfunded drivers, like a lot of the ones in the series Rise of the Field Fillers you mentioned, just overlooked because, you had road course specialists that would be in it, especially at Sears Point. You get Ron Fellows and Boris said, you got Brian Simo qualifying for the 2008 race at Sears Point in a year-old Car of Tomorrow that outpaced 3 or 4 unsponsored cars. That one stands out. I remember I wrote it wasn't really a fanfic, but it was almost like a movie parody of combining Die Hard, Speed, and Days of Thunder. And it was revolving around Steve Kinzer in 1995. And I remembered his bad luck that he had driving for Kenny Bernstein's team really stood out, and how, even though he only ran, I think 10 or 12 races that season, it left such a huge mark on me that, I was keeping an eye out for him and kind of hoping that, he would have better runs. Ultimately, he stepped back out of the sport. So, ones like that, there were, definitely over, the more you really kind of learn about the other drivers and you learn about the teams and their history, I mean, gosh, there's just entirely too many to count. I think every year I always kind of look out for which team or which driver seems to be having the worst luck, and just kind of hoping for them to pull out. I think this year probably it could be argued that maybe Noah Gragson has really had a difficult stretch of luck in the Cup Series. The Xfinity Series side, you look at teams like Alpha Prime that have really kind of had some bad luck. They had one of their cars DNQ today from Michigan. I think, I mean, it's kind of a long answer to your question, but I mean, it's really hard for one moment to really stand out, because when I start thinking of one moment, it reminds me of so many others over the years, whether it was Morgan Shepherd working on his own car to get the carburetor off of it at Darlington in 2017, I remember when we had Prism Motorsports was racking up a lot of start and park efforts in 2009, 2010. One of the first years that I covered racing at Sears Point. They brought Dave Blaney out, and Michael Waltrip didn't qualify for the race in a fully sponsored Prism entry. And so Blaney actually got to run the full race in that one. And that was really unusual because I had covered already, even at that point, seeing the 66 car pull out of the race very early. So things like that. There's always kind of, there's so many little quirks that pop up. And that's what's fascinating about it, is that all this stuff is happening simultaneously with a battle for the lead, or a championship battle, or winning the Daytona 500, or whatever the biggest story is. But this is also happening at the same time, and it can alter the way you experience a race, but it can also enhance it in other ways too.
Yeah, I remember some of that era you're talking about, that like late 2000s era, early 2010s, where you were seeing these start and park type entries and things like that. And, NASCAR's, they've changed the way that, I believe it's the way they've allocated prize money to kind of, I guess, take away or to, I guess, encourage guys to run the full race. I'm correct in that assumption, right?
Yeah. The charter system is the biggest part for the Cup Series. And that big part of that was definitely a different allocation of the purse money, which is one of the reasons they don't actually disclose the purse distribution anymore. And if you're not one of those 36 teams, I heard somewhere, even with Shane Van Gisbergen pulling off the win in the Chicago Street Course, that, as an open team, even though it was a track house entry, it was a non-chartered one, that, he made less money in that than had one of his teammates with a charter would have earned if they had won the race, which is kind of a shame, because, you do always, again, these small teams, whether it's the open teams today or part-time or underfunded efforts in the past, they're always the ones that, you watch and kind of hope to see if they have like a better run out there, or just see what kind of adversity they're dealing with. But yeah, it's become so unprofitable for a lot of, small efforts to really get into the Cup Series. And I think there's positives and negatives to that as well, because I do believe that the Xfinity Series is going through a renaissance right now. I think it's arguably the most competitive racing we see each weekend, because you have past Cup talent with pretty good programs, and then you have mid-tier programs that have really been able to kind of step up and be able to compete for top 10s, sometimes even top 5s with those guys. And you're keeping a lot of Cup Series regulars out of the field at the same time too. It ends up being just really competitive. But a lot of those teams would have been, and have been in some cases, like Carl Long's team would have been in the Cup Series just a decade ago, if not even less time than that.
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting to see the Xfinity Series every weekend, and it really truly does feel a lot of times like the way the Cup Series was back in the day. And even then, we've seen as years have gone on, even when the charter system first came into play, you would see open teams try to run the full schedule or most of it, and you don't see that anymore. It's, if you see an open entry on the schedule, it's very rare. I think there's one. We're recording this the week of the Michigan race. I think there's an open entry for the Michigan race that we're right before we're recording this, and obviously Daytona's right around this time of year too. We'll see some open entries there, but you're right. We don't see that sort of stuff anymore. So you mentioned kind of how you started covering races at Sears Point in 2010, and you were kind of starting to cover these field fillers, back of the pack type of drivers. So you run me through kind of how that came about.
Well, kind of a long story, but I'll jump into it. When I went to college, I started college in 2001, graduated in 2005. And back during that time period, I've been into the sport for about a decade. And I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to be that much interested in the sport, because I'll find something else in college that's going to grab my attention, and that'll be something else I'll do. Turns out instead, I was kind of getting my friends to get interested in the sport, and I was more of a fan of the sport than I had ever been by the time I had graduated. So the effort was to really try to find something to do with this interest, because I knew it was going to be a part of my life. I didn't think it would be entirely, something all consuming. There's been different degrees of it over the years. But then that was the effort. So like 2005, 2006, I'm starting to kind of try to figure out what's a good way to do, to cover the sport. And I was really kind of just I tried it from different angles. And as much as I knew that I was interested in the small teams, that wasn't actually the initial focus that I had. I was originally looking at just kind of race reviews in general and practicing, writing the deadline. And that was kind of the first challenge because outside of, projects in school, that hadn't really been my focus for creative writing. So I had to kind of practice doing that. One of the first things I did was I was actually on another podcast, racetalkradio.com. And I would actually do musical race reviews. Now I can't sing a lick, but I had fun writing, kind of doing a Weird Al thing and kind of changing musical lyrics to race reviews. And I got a gig on this podcast for a couple of years where I would try to do it over the phone, and then it would be out of sync with the music, and it was a mess. So I knew it was like, okay, I can't do this, so let's try something different. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I really kind of tried to do a full field rundown race reviews. 2008, I did a site called 43 Stories. And I would just try to just go through the field, do the finishing order, and just have something to say that I would notice from each driver in the field. And I kind of, my inspiration was Bob Jenkins. I would always remember he would do the leaderboard when it would come up. And every time the leaderboard came up, he'd say, oh, here's the leaderboard, the Fram field summary. Check out where your favorite driver's running. And I always liked that because I always figured there would be people that were Dale Earnhardt fans or whatever, but they'd also have fans of maybe the guy that's 3 laps down in 37th place. And it was kind of a fun thought. So I figured, okay, let's do a website where I have something to say about everybody in the field. And if people go to the page, they can, find whatever the story is. There were times that, and I don't know if this is a consequence more of the broadcast or just a lack of resourcefulness on my end, because I wasn't really on social media at the time. But there would be certain positions that I wouldn't have any notes for, like somebody who finished in 17th place or 23rd. But the people I always had something to say about was the race winner and the last place finisher. And then that was kind of the eureka moment. So in 2009, I started compiling statistics on who had the most last place finishes in NASCAR, and retooled the same website. What was 43 Stories became the 43rd Story, referencing how many cars were in the field back then. And then my brother, who usually prefers to stay anonymous on this, so I always call him Last Bro versus on that. He helped. He came up with NASCAR, and I was like, oh, it's perfect. And so we jumped on that. And ever since then, the focus of the site has been to update these statistics. At first, it was entirely about the statistics and just updating them. But then more and more, it progressed into profiles of the driver who finished in last, and then covering the different battles for position at the back of the field, like what problems the driver would have and then overcome, and then who would climb up the rankings or fall back down the rankings. And then it became like which past drivers that finished last were outperforming and having great runs. And that's kind of where the site has become today. I mean, I've been maintaining it ever since. We have 2 other staff writers, William Saki and Ben Schneider, that do the same thing in the ARCA series, as well as IndyCar, and sometimes even other series beyond that. And that's been the fun part. And I think our readers have really enjoyed that. And it's dovetailed into my track site coverage, where now I go over to the races there. I kind of spend the first part of the week kind of watching some of these other small teams and things that happen. And then I try to find a place that I can be at the beginning of the race to see what's happening at the back of the field each lap, and if anybody's coming down pit road. And it's a lot of fun. I like to bring everybody into it during my the stuff I do on Twitter at LastCar on Brock, or the post-race live streams I do and things of that nature. And it's kind of created kind of its own thing, which is interesting because I was thinking about this earlier and kind of getting ready for your show tonight. That, it used to be, when I was much younger, I could say, oh, who won the 1993 fall race at Martinsville? It's like, oh, that was Ernie Irvan, his first start or his first win with Robert Yates Racing and all that. But if I were to say who won the spring 2018 race at Martinsville, I have a little harder time of it because my focus, I feel like I get 2 races in one each time. And I could focus much more on the last place battle. And then there's sometimes stuff I miss at the front of the field, and I have to kind of catch up for at the end. And sometimes, like last week at Richmond, perfect example, the last place battle goes wire to wire. The entire field was separated by 5 laps, which is completely absurd. I mean, usually you have somebody that goes to the garage area, some mechanical failure, somebody crashes. But Richmond in particular has turned into this where the field is so tight together. Denny Hamlin's been very outspoken about this too. And I think we saw the most dramatic consequence of it in this last week here, where even BJ McLeod, who really had a good weekend going, a good qualifying run, started 21st. He finished in last, but it's not to say that they were that far off from everybody else. And those are the things that are fun. I was asked once when the starting park teams kind of went away, if it was still relevant to even talk about last place. And this is where I say it is, because it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. You see like what the strength of the field is and how competitive the races are becoming. I think it's a good measure of that. But again, kind of a long answer to your question, but that's kind of the overview there.
No, it's perfect. And I think, I was looking at some stats earlier from some races, and I think it was a race at Dover from I think it was the 70s or the 80s, where whoever won that race, I forgot who it was, won by 7 laps, or maybe it was Bristol. But the fact that at a track similar size to Richmond, the multiple times guys were winning by multiple laps. Now the last place finisher is only 5 laps down at the end of it. People don't realize how close that is, considering the fact that guys were winning races by multiple laps at certain times. So it is incredible. And I'll be honest with you, when I was watching Richmond, I was even thinking about that to some extent, because I was looking at this and I was like, wow, like whoever it was that was in last place, he's only 5 laps down. That was crazy to me. I don't know how long it would do. When was the last time all 36 drivers finished a race? That had to be the first time in a while. Maybe it's more common with the next gen, but I don't know. You'd know better than me. When was the last time before then that everybody had finished a race and that it entered?
It's a good question. It's the first time it's happened with the next gen car. The last time it happened, I believe, was 2018 at Homestead with Regan Smith at the Homestead race, the championship race that Joey Logano won. And what was fascinating with that one is Regan Smith, I think he finished 15 or 18 laps down. It was definitely a wider margin than what we saw here in Richmond last week. And he actually missed the start of the race. So he very nearly did not start and would have had no laps completed at all. But they had a mechanical issue before the start of the race, had to get back out there and then finish everything else, and everybody else finished too. So they unfortunately weren't able to climb any other positions. So it has been a few years. I think there's maybe about a dozen times that the last place finisher was classified as finishing under power, which would be pretty much the only examples of races where the whole field finished under power. I think one of the last points paying races at North Wilkesboro was a race that had everybody finish under power. And there had also more recently been actually some other races at Richmond, now that I'm thinking about it, as well as some races at New Hampshire that had that, which is kind of interesting. You kind of wonder if there's similarity, if it's something about a 3/4 to 1 mile relatively flat track lending itself to that or not. But that's kind of been the trend. So it has happened relatively recently, but it is still rare, very rare.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And also, another thing that strikes me is that you were talking about, telling these stories like I forget what your first blog site was already, first to 43rd or 43 stories is what it was.
43 stories. Yeah. Exactly.
It's interesting how everybody throughout the field has their own story, because personally, I was on Brendan Poole's pit box at the Chicago street race a few weeks ago. And it was interesting because those, you kind of overheard him talking with his team and how they were talking about we're doing this strategy so we can gain this many positions. This is where you're going to be on this lap after everybody else pits and that sort of stuff. Everybody throughout the field is running their own race. They're not necessarily, everybody wants to win, obviously, but they're not necessarily going for the win. They're just going for a way to just improve their position and finish the best they can. And you highlight a lot of those things. So, in light of a lot of that, can you tell me what it was like the first time you went to a race to cover a race, with the blog that you had at the time?
It's interesting because, I didn't realize, the first time I ever covered a race in person, with this, kind of cross that threshold from fan to kind of more media. I was actually working for another website, frontstretch.com. And I was actually covering the top 35 battle in points, which allowed me to kind of talk about not teams that were necessarily in last place, but ones that were just a few spots up trying to battle for provisional spots. And so I went in with that angle. One thing I learned from that first year is just there's so much stuff going on that, but you have a lot of latitude to kind of custom make your own experience. Like, that the drivers are most accessible on the first day of the weekend. And then from there, you're kind of focusing much more on the stats and what's happening in the races and so forth. So the first year I did this, whether the NASCAR banner was 2014. I was studying in law school before that, and that's a whole other story. So that's why there's kind of a few year gap there. But yeah, 2014. So luckily I had that background of at least doing it once before and knowing where things were. Yeah, I mean, I think I've always had kind of an eye towards the back of the grid and curiosity of like what the small team sponsors are going to look like. What teams even show up to the track. I mean, kind of, I still feature that in my entry list articles I do each week. So I think it didn't feel like so much a conscious decision to make sure I'm doing this and not that. It was much more like, okay, let's see who's here. And then you kind of have people you're kind of watching to begin with. And then the practice results come in, who's kind of the slower part of the field. So if they're not among the ones you're watching, you kind of watch them too. And then it kind of builds momentum from there. And I think it took a while. I think it took a while to really, well, actually, I think probably the bigger adjustment, to be perfectly honest, has been like what to wear and like what to bring with me. Because like, I used to have like a fanny pack that I would bring like, my scanner and stuff like that in. And then I had to try different things. But then I found I was holding things all the time. So I got like a vest that has pockets on it and tried to figure out stuff like that. Because the tricky part is being able to juggle what's happening, what you're seeing on the track, what you're hearing from the broadcast, what you're hearing from track officials, because they're going to confirm whether or not somebody's out of the race or going to the garage area. And then just running from one spot to the other to catch somebody, that's over by the haulers or anything like that. I think that's been more the challenge is like, how can I make sure that because when you're in the garage area, at the start of a race, and you probably saw this, where you were with Pool's team, the garage area at the start of a race is just dead quiet. Like there's nobody in there. There's nothing happening. And you could be completely separated from what's happening on the racetrack. So if you're, so that's why I try to kind of catch stuff trackside there to at least see the start of the race. But then, the further along the race goes, especially if you have some accidents, mechanical failures, it gets real busy and really crazy, and they're real fast. You got people going in and out of there. You got crews throwing everything around. And a lot of that doesn't get shown. You don't usually see it on TV, which is, I think, another reason that I think our readers have really enjoyed the site is I try to really kind of catch as much of that that's happening. Serious point, the Xfinity race this year in particular, I don't know how well it showed on TV because I still haven't watched the full broadcast of it. But the garage area was just wild in that one. I actually had to jump out of the way to not get hit by Anthony Alfredo as he came in there with the backup car. But that's part of the excitement. So I think it's knowing where you need to be and knowing that when you're looking at one thing and where you are, you're going to catch that one thing, but you're also at the same time missing other stuff that's happening out there. But I've always had pretty good faith in other media members that are there to cover the race win or to, or even if a big name driver finishes in last place, when that happens, it's usually, a whole lot more people there. That was kind of the interesting thing on the Cup Series side at Serious Point this year when Denny Hamlin got in his wreck. There were only two people there. It was myself and I believe it was somebody else from Front Stretch. And that was it. And if we weren't there, there weren't going to be any quotes from them there in the broadcast. And so that's just how. But that's the kind of stuff that I think is fascinating. So I've always tried to kind of look where people aren't looking. It's not been 100% successful because sometimes, I covered the All-Star race at Texas in 2021, and that was another race where nobody fell out. So I didn't hardly spend any time in the garage area. I was just on pit road for a little bit. And then I'm like, oh, wait, I'm gonna have to be here the whole time because the last place changed at the last second when, again, it turned out to be Denny Hamlin. I guess I'm his black cat when it comes to this. He came down pit road at the last second because he had to get some lug nuts tied because he didn't want to get a team crew suspension. But again, another thing that wasn't shown on TV. So just trying to capture those little moments. And I'm not the only one that does it. There's a lot of other people for their media outlets that do a fantastic job, on social media and so forth, to cover it there. But with mine, as well as my other staff writers, we really try to keep that focus as much as possible. And then, if usually when it's settled early in the race, we kind of use the latter part of the race to kind of then join in with everybody else and kind of follow the battle for the lead. Because you'll know when you hear from the officials, like when, nobody else is going to be taking over last place, unless you get a disqualification, which happens too.
Well, disqualifications happen more often nowadays than they have in the past. So, that's absolutely true. I'm certain that's got to be interesting. Like when you're highlighting, you mentioned the garage area being the way that it is. You're absolutely right. The beginning of the race, the garage area is dead quiet. But, pit road, I'll tell you, pit road's organized chaos. I've learned that too. Pit road's organized chaos. But, you also discussed, as you were answering your question there, you discussed how you went to law school for a brief period of time. So what happened there?
Oh, yeah, certainly. There's actually there's an article. Sadly, it's not up anymore because NASCAR.com laid off their writers. But back in 2010, I was interviewed by Mark Allman, who is a veteran writer there on the site. And the headline was Law Student Tracks Battle for Last Place. Because that was back when I think it was my second year of law school. But my father's an attorney. I grew up in, an attorney's household here. And the goal from the beginning, I think for both my brother and myself, was to one day go into law school and at least try that out, just because it's a family business, just like Kyle Petty was with Richard Petty. I think that, you're the son of a farmer, son of a race car driver, you try to go into the same thing, simply because, you have that background and you think it could certainly be of help. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And mine was more the case of the latter. But I went into college. I studied English, but I always enjoyed creative writing, which I think has been another source of my, so there's certainly a lot of creative writing involved in doing the website there. I always believed, that, going into law school is like another outlet for, kind of creative writing and I always like research and history, and there's a lot of aspect of that. And I had some really interesting classes. I actually received, I studied at John F. Kennedy Law School in Pleasant Hill. Sadly, the campus isn't around anymore. They got merged into somebody else, and there was something there. But it was a very blue collar campus there. Had some great classmates. I studied there from 2008 to 2011. Got my Juris Doctor, so I do have that degree. I took the bar exam, California bar exam, 3 consecutive times, did not pass it. Came the closest on my second. I was 16 points off on that. And at that point I was just burnt out. And I'm a Bills fan, so I know it happens the 4th time. It was, but it was a worthwhile experience. And I think a couple of things I learned from my experience in that, first of all, getting a greater appreciation for what my father's job does. I've always had a better understanding of that. But also, I really enjoy research. There's doing what's called a statement of facts when you're trying to break down, trying to just establish the elements of a case, and you can kind of make it persuasive at the same time while you're describing it. I feel like there's still a tinge of that whenever I write a script for a video or an article, that if I want to make it persuasive, or if I want to make it, a person that's in it more sympathetic, I do feel like that still kind of stayed in there. And also feel like it really helped kind of tighten up my writing. I look at a lot of stuff that I wrote in college, and it's like, I wouldn't publish it now. It's like, it's too dense and just kind of all over the place. And I feel like in law school, you have to write very efficiently. And it helped out with that. Now, it was not planned to be just a writing course. But I'm a big advocate, and my family is very much of this too. You take what helps you, and, just stick with that. And that was the case. And the other part of it too is all that I was describing with the NASCAR site and that coming up. The NASCAR site basically started right at the start of my second of my third year in law school. So I think it did become a bit of a distraction there. And while I felt that I could do both, that was a bit too much. So we decided to kind of go that direction. But very happy I did. My family's been very supportive of that. I'm glad to have had that background. I think it's helped my writing, and I still use a lot of those skills today. And I think it narrowed my focus a bit more in how I wanted to approach the site, because I think that's a big thing with the NASCAR site that maybe people don't understand is, like, I think maybe if it ended up in somebody else's hands, it probably would have ended up being like a satire site or like a joke site, and just say, oh, look at this loser. Like, this is terrible. They couldn't even get this pit stop right and all that. It could have gone that direction. But, while I do think that, there is some humor that's inherent in the sport, and I do still get a laugh, when I describe, this site to people that aren't familiar with it, there's also, I try to really treat these drivers and teams with respect as much as possible there, to understand, what they're dealing with. And, nobody wants to finish in last place. I think one of the big reasons for that was JD McDuffie, who I was the subject of the first book I wrote, because he had the most last place finishes at the time I started the site. And the fact that his final last place finish was the one that cost him his life at Watkins Glen in 1991, that definitely colored things differently when I was compiling the statistics. And I think the other moment that definitely narrowed the focus of the site was the loss of Jason Leffler in 2013, where he had finished last at Pocono a couple days before. That was really the turning point that encouraged me to kind of really expand on the articles and not just update the statistics, which I had even with Leffler's article that week. There was a little bit more detail in there, but it's really kind of set the mission statement this last decade to really kind of chronicle these stories. And hopefully other people find that interesting too, much like I find it interesting reading these old stories and Grand National Scene or, old newspaper clippings too. At least that's my hope. But again, kind of a long answer to your question, but I definitely took the scenic route to get where I am now.
Man, dude, you have passion. That's the biggest thing. You have passion for your field, dude. Go on, go crazy. That's all we care about, is that you have passion, and you obviously do. And, again, it just goes back to everybody has a story. Part of the philosophy I have with this podcast is everybody has a story. And, you're highlighting that too with these last place finishers in NASCAR. Every one of these people, they're all human beings that all have stories. They're trying to make it in the sport one way or another. And, at some point, a lot of these race teams were, at one point, they were these guys that were finishing in last 3 or 4 laps down that were getting passed by guys. Think about like Front Row Motorsports is a great example of this. At one point, they were starting parking, maybe 13, 14 years ago, not that long ago. And nowadays, Michael McDowell is in position to make the playoffs on points, and they've won a few races. So, it's interesting to kind of see that. So I guess this leads me to this. Have you ever seen anybody that you started covering that you were usually covering sometimes in those last place finish battles that you've seen work their way up as time's gone on? Or what's kind of the coolest story you've seen with that? Rags to riches of NASCAR, if you will.
That's a very good question. The current, my mind immediately goes to the Xfinity series and a lot of these drivers that are developing into part-time efforts. Ryan Ellis comes to mind, especially with the news today of him getting the full-time ride for Alpha Prime next year. That's fantastic for him. I remember, a lot, especially now with social media being what it is. And as much as I'm not a big fan of Twitter and so forth on there, I think it in the racing context, it's been great in terms of following drivers up the ranks, much like you're describing. There's a few of these drivers that, and I don't know how many of them are really. They're still climbing the ladder now. It takes time. Believe me, I understand that from my own experience. But think about Brad Perez. I got a picture with him at Darlington when he was, helping out teams out there. Before he went over to Martin's Motorsports back then. And then I get, we had the NASCAR logo on his car for the last couple of Series Point races. He makes his first truck start there and his first Xfinity start there. He's certainly an example of it. Again, Ryan Ellis, mentioning him. Kyle Weatherman and Bailey Curry, with the fact that they were driving for Mike Harmon's team, and they had some great runs in 2020. Weatherman got Harmon his first ever top 10 at Kentucky, and just how exciting that was. Especially on that particular weekend, because that had a little bit of both, where Weatherman got a top 10 and then he finished last at the same track the next day because of a wreck on the first lap. It just showed really, how things can change that way. But I mean, it's still, it's still a heck of a story from that weekend. Josh Bilicki comes to mind. I run into him a lot at the track. I ran into him at Phoenix last year, and he introduced me to his friends there at the team. It's like, oh, he's this guy who talks about last place finishers. Like, who's the leader this year? Is actually one thing we do. I talk about, kind of balancing the humor and the respect aspect of it here. One thing that we kind of have fun with is actually one of the drivers themselves suggested, hey, if we win the NASCAR championship, which is for getting the most last place finishes, do we get anything like a trophy or something? I'm like, oh man, it's brilliant. So my idea was I came up with certificates. And actually, when I go to the championship race, like we have done the last couple of years, I have a whole bunch of certificates and I present them to the drivers there that win them. And again, try to just keep things light, especially, teams that are frustrated and they have a difficult part. I think it's nearly all cases that I presented these. They just kind of, they just kind of roll with it, and they've been really good sports about it. I mean, these guys are professional athletes, and that's certainly the case. But this leads me to another driver that I probably run into more than any other at these races, and that'd be JJ Yaley. Here's a guy that has been in the sport for years. I mean, he was a rookie back when, you were starting to watch the sport there and in the Cup Series, driving for Joe Gibbs, driven for innumerable different teams over the series. And just this year, I mean, we saw it at Atlanta in that rain shortened race. He gets a top 10 out there for Rick Ware Racing. Massive for him. I mean, it was just, and those are the moments that you really enjoy. So, and that's the fun part is you never know who's going to be the hero each week. It could be a young up and comer that's trying to figure things out. Or it could be a veteran driver that, it's been a while since they've had a top 10. And I think one of my frame of reference for a lot of these is probably my most favorite driver I had growing up, which was Jerry Nadeau, first driver I followed up through the ranks at all. Seeing him run off course at Sears Point after starting outside pole in 98, following him through when he won this only race at Atlanta in 2000. And then ultimately, unfortunately, his career cut short by that accident at Richmond in 2003. That was a heck of a ride. That's probably the first example I had of somebody I followed up the ranks, literally from last place to winning to getting steady rides from there. So there's too many to count. Kind of like your earlier question. There's too many to count, but those are the first ones that come to mind.
Man, that's incredible. I mean, just hearing about, following all these people kind of up through the ranks, like that's awesome, and it's cool to hear that, these teams have kind of gotten into what you're doing. They've kind of gotten into it a little bit. Obviously, they don't like finishing last. I don't think anybody would, but it's one of those things where that's the case. And obviously, back in the we talked a bit earlier about, how big the fields were back in the day. I mean, there were a lot of teams where finishing last was a success because they made the race. I mean, exactly. Some teams, like if they made the race on a weekend, that was success. So stuff like that, those are the types of stories that you highlight in those instances. So, you've also spent some time dabbling in YouTube as well. So, it's by no means, the primary way that you put your content out there, but you still use it in a lot of forms. So kind of where did YouTube start to become a thing for you in the way that you go about creating that sort of content? I know you've partnered with NASCAR Man and all sorts of stuff like that. So kind of where is that all come in?
Well, YouTube kind of had its own parallel storyline to the website and almost the exact same time because I started my YouTube account in 2006. So the first videos that are on there are very fuzzy footage that I took off a digital camera when I was sitting in turn 2 as a fan, watching
at Sears Point. I've seen those videos. So,
yep. So those are the first videos on the channel, and they're still up there. But that was it still interests me that people still watch those. I still get some comments on them here and there. But that was how it started. It started originally as just kind of playing around with it. I didn't know anything about video editing or recording or any of that stuff. And Just kind of posted videos from the track, and people seemed to like those. And then I was filming. I didn't know how to do video capture, so I would hold that same camera to my computer, and there's really fuzzy clips of races on there that are also still up on the channel that I did for like big moments that I enjoyed. I remember at the time there wasn't much footage of Jerry Nadeau's career at the time, which, you know, I mean, nowadays with YouTube as big as it is, you got full races on there, but back in, I betray the white in my beard here to talking about just how it used to be, but it did used to be. You had like 10-minute videos there, and that was as big as you could make them. And I had some old stuff there, and but then the first video series that I did in 2008, about the same time I was transitioning towards the NASCAR site, was I did starting grids. I'm very outspoken on the quality of broadcasts and the way that the sport is covered, because I believe they're the most convincing advertising for the sport. And it's not a redundancy compared to radio broadcasting. I think TV broadcasting is unbelievably important. I hear these stories about AI trying to take it over and people not caring about it. I think that risks losing turning it into a lost art.
I'll say as a broadcaster, someone that's done play-by-play broadcasting, AI cannot broadcast any sport at all. Can't do it. Can't do it.
No. It's all because it's all about the humanity of it. That's what great broadcasting is. You're capturing, you're synthesizing all these statistics and what's happening in front of you, and the human element of it and the context of everything that's happening. You can't program that, because it's like I think it's one of the truest human expressions, really. I don't think I'm too exaggerating in saying it, but one aspect I always loved of those broadcasts was how they introduced the drivers, and very similar to the 43 stories thing, introducing the starting lineup for these races and how that evolved away from showing car pictures or updating paint schemes. And this was at a time that it was really critical to do it, because that was really when Dale Jr. even had 2 sponsors, and so paint schemes were changing more regularly. I was really surprised that traditional starting grids didn't really return to prominence. Even today, as much as NBC is credited for having great broadcasts, even they don't really use car pictures in theirs, which I think is a shame. But that was something I tried to bring back. And my frame of reference was, these are just slideshows. I mean, it's very simple animations. I took a Photoshop class at the time, and just kind of learned how to create these different layers and kind of make it somewhat convincing, and mixing some music into it. And I did that for 4 years. I did, 4 seasons. I still do them every once in a while, do them for the Daytona 500. I have them as a bonus to my Patreon. And people always enjoy that. Patreon.com/LastCarOnBrock. But they always, those were a lot of fun. That was my first regular video series. They didn't get a lot of hits. I think I tried to add some other elements, because of course, once the race starts, who's going to want to go back and see what the starting lineup was? So I tried to make it into almost my weekly show, where I put like some other clips in, or sketches, or just anything, just trying everything across the board. And that was my first experience to YouTube. But then this overlapped again with when I was in law school. So I kind of set that aside for a couple of years. And I really didn't start making videos again regularly on my channel till really about 2019. Really during the COVID era, I really kind of went back into making more produced content. And I think a big reason for that was, as you mentioned him, NASCAR Man, on his channel there. I was very fortunate to cross paths with him. He, had these articles he was writing for Racing Reference, and they were very well researched and very comprehensive. And he and I started talking, and, he didn't have the audio equipment available, and I did. And I was like, well, I can narrate these scripts for you. And you could make some videos, and we'll do that. He's written tremendous scripts. I mean, it really challenged me to kind of get back in the game as well, and kind of make my own scripts. And so I think that's where the challenge has kind of been too. I get a lot of people that stop me and say, "Oh, I loved it when you did this video on Davey Allison," for example, the most recent one there. It's like, well, I always try to be as quick as possible and say, look, well, I thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed my narration, but that was entirely NASCAR Man's work there. He did the writing, he did the editing, he produced it. It's on his channel. That's a separate thing. So, and I think, he and I have very similar approaches to the way we do our videos. I try to lean more into kind of more of a cinematic aspect, although I can't even feel like I take credit for that either, because I feel like his Davey Allison video kind of went into that too. So that's kind of the that's kind of the aspect. So I think we both challenge each other, and that's what's been great about it. And I think it's really helped both our channels grow since then. So that's been the exciting part. But what we both share is just a love for the research of the sport. I always view it as like a fisherman, you're the one fisherman for the town. And I could hook this fish and just enjoy it for myself and just be like, oh, isn't this great? Like, here's this obscure thing from NASCAR history, and I'm just going to kind of just obsess on this and not share it with anybody. But it's like, when you have something like that that's really interesting, you kind of should share it with everybody and just say, look, here's what I found. It's like some of it is stuff that I'm interested in that I know would make a good story. But then a lot of times when I'm doing the research, I find this other stuff. It's like, you wouldn't believe this. You wouldn't believe that this happened and then this happened. And the experience of putting that all together and making it something that people can enjoy, especially nowadays, where I do think there's a bit of a rift between like younger fans and older fans in the sport. I don't know how much this has helped try to bridge that gap, but I like to think that it has to a certain extent, because I think that I don't try to talk over anybody or exclude people from this. I'd like to bring them in. And I do the 500 Days series, for example, on the 2001 series season. I mean, there's people now that, were too young to, some that weren't even born during that season and are now experiencing, as close as I can replicate, because there's nothing that replaces it, as close as I can replicate to what it was like to experience the key moments of what was a massive season in the sport's history. And that's what I try to do with all my videos.
Exactly. I mean, the context you provide in your videos is very interesting. You talk about 500 days. I mean, talking about all these movements in NASCAR, probably the craziest, silliest season in NASCAR history, I think, and all that sort of stuff. And even talking about, a video you did with NASCAR Man, the 1988 Daytona 500 or Speed Weeks. I mean, telling the story about Tim Richmond, telling the story about debating about spoiler angle and all that sort of stuff about, should they bring the spoilers down? Should they bring them up to try to make the cars handle better? First race without restrictor plates, providing all this interesting context, even the kart split video, which is, of course not NASCAR related, but, interesting to provide, exactly, okay, what went into the whole kart split and all that sort of stuff. And that's just, that's awesome. It's to see just all of that context, really come together. So, just kind of tell me, what do you envision for the future? You've done all these things, you're in a much a different place than you have been. So kind of like, what's the future hold for you feel?
Well, I think the goal, like anybody would want to, is it would be great to be able to just, the greatest enemy to doing anything creative, and you probably agree to this too, is time. There just never seems to be enough time to do everything. I'd love to be able to just have this be something sustaining and just be able to commit more time to do it. Because there's, so I work 5 days a week in between. I mostly on the weekends is mostly taken up with updating the website, and then whatever time in between is just putting the videos together. And sometimes a video that probably would take ordinarily maybe a week is probably going to take a month. That's kind of the way it usually goes, which is why I don't have the most regular update schedule that most people have. It's not an unusual situation. There's a lot of very talented YouTubers that are work very hard outside. I know Slap Shoes in particular, works all those hours there with UPS. So, it's very, difficult circumstances with that. And he produces great content as well. But, I think that what I'd like to do is just keep producing these. I'm trying to kind of create a moment here where I can produce more regular content. I think that's been the biggest goal, especially since 2019. Sometimes a different idea comes up when I'm halfway through something else. And, it's like you reach that moment where it's like, do I stop working on this and start working on that? Or can I do both? Or can I still work on this and then in my free time work on that? Or do I wait till later? Those are kind of the things that come up. But, I think that's really the big thing. And I think, I got a couple of big stuff, projects I'm working on here. As we speak, I'm actually in the process of finishing my second book, which is a biography of Derek Cope. The book is going to be called Cope. We just got that worked out there with Derek and his wife, Alicia, who have been tremendously helpful on that project. Hoping to get that out this winter. Don't have a release date set yet, but we're in the final phases of getting that ready to go. And then the focus is going to be towards, of course, promoting that and doing some work there. And my plan is after that to really kind of take some time off from really writing books and focusing more on the YouTube channel to get it back up to speed and then have it be more competitive with some of the other YouTube creators out there. It won't be back to the way it was in 2008 with the starting grids. I think my live streams have kind of taken the place of that. As well as my entry list articles on NASCAR. But in terms of just at least, I think that'll free up things to a point where I can produce videos on a more regular basis and really just see where it goes from there. I think that's kind of the biggest thing. I've been very fortunate that people are supporting the channel. We're getting close to 20,000 subscribers on there. And, we're still kind of a small fish in a big pond. Even NASCAR Man has many more people following on his channel as well. They should be. He produces tremendous content, but just looking to stay in the conversation. I think that's kind of the big thing, which is not too unlike a lot of the drivers I talk about on the site at the same time. So sometimes life imitates art, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Stay in the conversation. That's what you're trying to do. You're letting drivers be a part of the conversation, and you know what? You're doing all those same things right here. So, big thank you, Brock, for coming on Next Gen Creators here. And you know what, we're really cool to just hear about you telling the stories that maybe not all people think about, but again, we go back. This is why we're doing a podcast like this. Everybody has a story. All these content creators like you have a story, and you have a passion for telling it in NASCAR, and that's really awesome. So, folks, Brock Beard on Next Gen Creators here this week. What a conversation that was with Brock Beard as he told his story about how he came up with Last Car on Brock. That's what took up the majority of the conversation, but it was incredible to just hear the passion that he has for what he does and to hear kind of what gave him the inspiration to do what he does. Talk a bit about his workflow whenever he's at the racetrack or covering, and just kind of talk about what it's like to cover something that's a little bit interesting and a little bit different from what you'll normally see. You don't normally see people covering, last place finishers or anything like that. But Brock Beard talked about that, and it was very cool to just hear his passion that he has absolutely for it. And, hearing just a little bit about what he wants to do in the future. He mentioned he's finishing up his a biography with Derek Cope. And then from there, hopefully doing a little bit more YouTube as time goes on. He makes some really incredible YouTube content as well. Some really deep dives into NASCAR history that just, it gives some incredible context to everything that he does. And it was really cool to just hear some of his philosophy, some of what kind of goes into the content that he creates, and the passion that he has for something very unique that you do not always see people covering in NASCAR. Once again, I'm Joshua Lipowski. Thank you so much, very much, for tuning in to this episode of Next Gen Creators, where we highlight the next generation of NASCAR content creators. Joshua Lipowski signing off for now with the Daily Downforce.